Partisanship serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasionally riot and insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which finds a facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passion. That was George Washington talking about political parties in his farewell address. Welcome to the Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we are talking about the history of political parties in the United States. As we saw in his farewell speech, President George Washington was always skeptical of political parties. So he sought to create an enlightened administration which was devoid of any political parties. But the struggle with opposing political ideology existed within his own cabinet, and he struggled to contain it during his tenure. President George Washington had appointed two political adversaries to his cabinet, Alexander Hamilton as Treasury Secretary and Thomas Jefferson as the Secretary of State. His hope was that the two great minds could work together in national interest. Hamilton and Jefferson, though, differed radically in their approaches from each other. Hamilton was in favor of the federal government assuming the entire burden of debts incurred by the states during the Revolutionary War. Jefferson, on the other hand, sided with the local farmers and believed that moneyed business interests in New England states stood to benefit from Hamilton's plan. In response, Hamilton assembled a group of powerful supporters to promote his plan, a group that would eventually become the Federalist Party. Not to be outdone, Jefferson also rallied the support of individuals around his principles and formed the Democratic Republican Party. What was ironic about this was that Jefferson himself had once said that if I could not go to heaven but with a party, I would not go there at all. The Federalists initially had the upper hand, with Federalist John Adams replacing Washington in 1797. But the Democratic Republicans came charging back with Jefferson's 2 terms, followed by James Madison's 2 terms, and James Monroe's 2 terms ending in 1825. Soon, the Federalists faded from the scene. So with the Federalists fading into oblivion, the Democratic Republicans were the only political party in town. Oh, so that meant the upcoming presidential elections just had one candidate? Interestingly, no. In the presidential election of 1824, 4 Democratic Republican candidates ran against each other. Andrew Jackson won the popular vote, but 99 electoral votes and the lack of an electoral majority threw the election to the House of Representatives, who ended up giving the victory to John Quincy Adams. In response, New York Senator Martin Van Buren helped build a new political organization, the Democratic Party. The aim was to back Jackson, who easily defeated Adams in the 1828 elections. During his presidency, Andrew Jackson vetoed a bill renewing the charter of the Bank of the United States in 1832. And subsequently, his opponents founded the Whig Party, led by Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky. By the 1840s, the Democrats and the Whigs were both national parties, and they had supporters across the various regions of the country, and both these parties dominated the US political system. With respect to the election of presidents, the Democratic Party was the more dominant one, electing Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, James Polk, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan between 1828 and the beginning of the Civil War. The Whigs, on the other hand, managed to elect only two ill-fated presidents. Ill-fated meaning William Harrison, who delivered a long inaugural address on a cold and windy day and died of pneumonia about a month into his presidency, and Zachary Taylor, who took office in 1849 but died of acute gastroenteritis 16 months later. The interesting part was that during that time, it was the Whigs, not the Democrats, who believed in using the central government's power to make internal improvements to the country, such as roads and canals. The Democrats, though a party of the common man, were openly hostile to blacks, whether slave or free. Actually, John C. Calhoun, a prominent Democrat from South Carolina, oftentimes lamented that the phrase in the Declaration of Independence that all men were created equal had become the most false and dangerous of all political errors. And subsequently, slavery became a big topic of debate at that time. The Whig Party split into a northern wing that held on to the principles of an active central government, and the southern wing, whose members were concerned that a central government was powerful enough to end slavery. The divisive slavery issue came to a head in 1854 with the passing of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which authorized new territories and states to decide for themselves if they wanted to allow slavery. This riled up the anti-slavery faction of the Whigs Party, and they decided that their party wasn't sufficiently committed to halting the spread of slavery. So this faction splintered off and formed the Republican Party, along with the anti-slavery faction of the Democrats. There were three prominent Whigs who turned Republican, and they were Thaddeus Stevens, William Seward, and Abraham Lincoln. The non-Republican Whigs kept getting swept in other movements, and by 1856, the Whig Party had pretty much sunk into oblivion. So you now had the Democrats and the Republicans as the two prominent political parties. The early Republicans were so progressive that they were often referred to as Red Republicans. And they had a vision of America as a land free not only from slavery, but also from wage slavery, meaning the business exploitation of laborers. They were pro-independent farmers and the self-employed, and against the power of capitalists. Yes, you heard it right. Against the power of capitalists. The Democrats were still split between the Southern Democrats and the Northern Democrats. And at the party's national convention in 1860, the Southern Democrats nominated John Breckinridge, while the Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas for the presidency. And this split helped the Republican Party candidate Abraham Lincoln win the presidency, even though he had won only 40% of the popular vote. From 1860 to 1929, the Republicans dominated the presidency, electing 12 of the 15 presidents. For a brief period after the end of the Civil War, Republicans fought for the rights of the black Americans. There were reports of abuses and violence against former slaves in the post-war South, and the Republicans were frustrated by the inaction of Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson. Subsequently, a faction which was more radical gained increasing sway in the Congress among the Republicans. The radicals drove the Republicans to pass the country's first civil rights bill in 1866. Yes, the first civil rights bill in 1866 was passed due to the efforts of the Republicans. And they also fought for the voting rights for black men. Just men, because voting rights for women was still a distant milestone. Furthermore, Republicans twice managed to amend the Constitution so that it stated that everyone born in the United States was a citizen and that all citizens needed to have equal protection of the law and the right to vote couldn't be denied because of race. And they required southern states to legally enact many of these ideas, at least in principle, to be readmitted to the Union. We are often a product of our environment. But when you are a politician, besides the environment, there are other factors that come in play that end up influencing you. Factors like who is financing you and what the ideology of the opposition is. And a lot of these factors soon came into play to influence the Republican politicians. Now, before the Civil War, the North was more industrialized than the South. And after the Civil War, the industrialization of the North only intensified. Since the Republicans were in power during this period, the industrialization of the North led to people getting richer. And as they got richer, they owed their wealth to the party in power, that is, the Republicans. And slowly, the rich folk started taking more and more interest and a leading role in the Republican Party. And slowly, their interests, rather than the interests of the black Southerners, started becoming a higher priority for the Republicans. By the 1870s, the Republicans no longer cared about what was happening in the South. The party had achieved its founding aim of ending slavery and had gone quite a bit further. So that provided a good rationalization for not doing more. And subsequently, the cause of equal rights for black citizens would now essentially vanish from the national American politics for decades. So while the Republicans grew stronger in the industrialized North, the Democrats maintained a stronghold in the South with strong support among the northern city Catholic immigrants and small Midwestern farm owners. For the Democrats, the South became known as the Solid South, and they dominated there until the mid-1960s when the Republicans began to rise. While the Democrats and the Republicans continued to be the mainstream politicians, there were other political parties that formed, though they did not last too long, at least not long enough to become mainstream. These included the Equal Rights Party in 1872, the Populist Party in 1892, and the Socialist Party in 1901. But one such party in 1912 would influence the presidential election, even though it was not mainstream. I'm talking about Teddy Roosevelt's Progressive Party, also known as the Bull Moose Party. Wait, wasn't Teddy Roosevelt a Republican? Yes, indeed, but only up till 1909. Now, as we saw earlier, towards the end of the 19th century, there was rapid industrialization, which led to the creation of the business class. And this rapid industrialization also ended up creating a gap between the rich and the poorer sections of the society. So as the 20th century dawned, progressive reformers within both parties wanted to check the power of corporations and the wealthy. And all this came to a head in the election of 1912. In the fray, from the Republican side, was President William Howard Taft, who was pro-big business and for maintaining the status quo. The Democratic candidate was Woodrow Wilson, who felt that a government intervention was needed to manage urbanization and industrialization better. And there was a third candidate in the fray, Teddy Roosevelt, from the newly formed Progressive Party. And he too, like Woodrow Wilson, represented the need for reform. Teddy Roosevelt's entry in the fray ended up splitting the Republican vote, and Woodrow Wilson's appeal to the middle-class man who aspired to own property led to victory for the Democrat Woodrow Wilson. Mind you, I said middle-class man, not middle-class families, because women still did not have the right to vote. And it is interesting that maybe for the first time, the middle class was formally recognized, and it ended up influencing the outcome of the election. When Woodrow Wilson became president, the Democrats began to embrace more progressive ideals, like using government to solve social problems, controlling the power of large business interests, and instituting social reforms like extending the right to vote and banning child labor. However, in the South, Democrats continued to be bastions of racism. Even though Republicans too had embraced progressive ideas, but once Woodrow Wilson took office, they turned sharply against many of his progressive reforms. And it is around this time that the Republicans started becoming the party of businesses. They thought prosperity of business was good for America, which meant that they needed to have a hands-off approach towards big businesses. And it worked very well for them throughout the 1920s when they were able to send 3 presidents to the White House. But then, in 1929, the economy crashed and the Great Depression began. Once the economy crashed, many blamed Republicans for the reckless pro-business policies that led to the collapse of the economy. And President Herbert Hoover, who strongly believed that the government did not need to intervene during an economic collapse and pray that the markets corrected themselves, had to bear the majority of the blame for the economic collapse of 1929. At this time, the American public was desperately looking for some government intervention to get them out of the recession and get them back to work. And the man of the hour, the Democratic candidate for president, Franklin D. Roosevelt. FDR won the election in 1932 and ended up being the only president to win the election 4 times. Well, when you've gone through the Great Depression, the voter is very unlikely to choose a different candidate or an opposing political party. And true to his word, FDR used the government's power to get the economy out of the recession. His overall policy, known as the New Deal, included features like Social Security, unemployment insurance, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation or the FDIC, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and the Works Progress Administration. From 1933 to the end of the 1960s, the Democrats dominated national politics. The New Deal programs were popular and effective, so the Republican administration of Dwight Eisenhower left them in place in the 1950s, and so did the Democratic Lyndon Johnson administration in the 1960s. So the Democrats seem to have had it good with respect to the economy, and then came the big variable. Democratic President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law in 1964. And after signing the law, Lyndon Johnson said, "I think we just delivered the South to the Republican Party for a long time to come." And almost on cue, the Republicans launched the new Southern strategy. And this was largely an attempt to capture the South by playing on the fears of the white community with respect to the civil rights movement. So the party, which was all for equality and civil rights during the Lincoln era, suddenly found an emerging voter base which could be exploited after the Civil Rights Act became law. The Republican Southern strategy further expanded across United States, targeting the suburban and rural areas with the aim of exploiting the fears of the white communities with respect to racial integration. In a 1981 interview, Republican strategist Lee Atwater explained that the Southern strategy rested on stressing race without overtly mentioning it. And to counter this trend, the Democrats started veering to the right and started quoting Wall Street and corporate money in the late 70s through the 90s to win back the voters they had lost to the Republicans. However, one of the most important milestones that happened was in 2010, where Republicans dominated state gubernatorial and legislative elections, which allowed them to gerrymander district boundary lines to their advantage. And it is here that you started seeing presidential candidates winning the popular vote, yet losing because of the Electoral College. And on that note, we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. Which company owns the biggest share of the submarine cable network? With 63,605 miles, or 8.5% of the global submarine cable network, Google owns the biggest share. So the answer is D, Google. Question for the current episode. Which was the tightest race in US presidential history? Was it A, JFK versus Richard Nixon in 1960? B, George W. Bush versus Al Gore in 2000? C, John Quincy Adams versus Andrew Jackson in 1824? Or D, Rutherford B. Hayes versus Samuel J. Tilden in 1876? Once again, which was the tightest race in US presidential history? A, JFK versus Richard Nixon in 1960? B, George W. Bush versus Al Gore in 2000? C, John Quincy Adams versus Andrew Jackson in 1824? Or D, Rutherford B. Hayes versus Samuel J. Tilden in 1876? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in today's episode. In the next episode, we look at some of the exciting and scandalous spy stories from the Cold War era. Scandals where CIA agents spied for the KGB and vice versa. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.